Wheeling, West Virginia is home to the Mount St. Joseph Mother House. The large property has expanded over the years for additional things like a retreat center. Back in the early summer of 1977, it was a place where a young woman was contemplating taking her final vows to become a nun. Part of this was a silent retreat at the convent filled with prayer and contemplation. As such, one morning, she went to the shared kitchen, grabbed a piece of fruit, and headed up to a scenic hill amongst the dozens of acres to sit on a bench with her Bible. Just a while later, a caretaker for the property would find her lifeless body in the middle of the field, in broad daylight, yards from the overturned bench she had been sitting on. Her case is coming up on half a century without answers. Had Sister Robin been attacked by a stranger lurking on the remote property, waiting for an opportunity to attack? Or was she betrayed by someone close to her? We may finally be close to getting that answer thanks to modern technology and carefully preserved DNA evidence. My name is Megan, and each week I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Roberta Elam, otherwise known as Sister Robin. Roberta Elam was born on August 23, 1950 in St. Paul, Minnesota. She was the oldest of 4 children, and the more I heard about her and learned about her, the more I realized she was a girl after my own heart. Her brother described her as very stubborn and opinionated and direct. She loved to write poetry and discuss the deeper aspects of life. Probably unlike what you would imagine of someone wanting to be a nun, she drove an orange Fiat sports car. And though she was planning to become a nun, she really wanted to become a priest, and she thought the idea that only men could become Catholic priests was ridiculous. Her brother said that if she had lived to do so, she would have become a social activist to the fullest extent. She was athletic, she liked to jog, she liked to hike. Others described her disposition as brilliant and gregarious. Roberta had a typical childhood and was considered the leader of the pack with her siblings. She graduated high school and did all the usual things like go to prom and date boys, but as she approached college, that's when she began to be more drawn into religious groups. This was in part because of her desire to do social work in conjunction with her strong Catholic faith. Throughout her childhood, she had lived in Minnesota and Illinois and eventually Allendale, New Jersey. With her focus shifting towards religious studies, she did undergraduate work at Marillac College, which was a Catholic sisters' college in St. Louis, Missouri. She was one of the last graduating classes there before it shut its doors. She then went on to Fordham University in New York, where she got her master's in theology. In 1977, Roberta Elam was best known as Sister Robin, and that's what I'm going to be calling her for consistency purposes throughout the rest of this episode. She was considered a novitiate nun. If you're like me and you don't know what the process is to become a nun, I did a little research to at least be able to give you guys a high-level overview. So first, you must have been baptized Catholic and take other Catholic sacraments such as communion and confirmation. For people who grew up in the Catholic faith, most of these are already completed during childhood. Nuns must be at least 18 years old, sometimes 21, but back then it was primarily 18, and be unmarried without children. This is because nuns are to have a primary relationship with God and not have other vows in the way of that. When you begin to think about becoming a nun, you're supposed to seek spiritual advisement from priests and other nuns. You're then supposed to pray to discern your vocation and what it is you want to accomplish as a nun, and meet with vocational directors. It's then recommended that you research convents that align with your vocational goals and go there for retreats and to get a feel for it. Once you decide on one you think is a good fit, you enter the pre-postulate phase where you continue to see if the community is a good fit for you, and they decide if you are a good fit for them. This varies by order and location and involves things like interviews and retreats. At this point, you continue life outside the convent but still participate and study there. If it seems like a good fit, the order will invite you formally to become a candidate. This is considered the postulate stage. You begin living there and working there part-time, but still partially maintain your outside life. This part usually takes anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. After that, you enter the novitiate stage, where you are called the official title of sister, you become fully part of the community, and you make initial vows and spend at least a year of intense prayer and study on what the final vows entail. During this stage, some orders ask that you choose a saint's name upon taking your public vows, but not all do. Each year, you do temporary vows for things such as poverty, chastity, and obedience, and other vows specific to the order. Once you and the leaders of the order decide you're ready, that's when you make your final vows. I wanted to give that level of detail, particularly because depending on the source material, they will conflate the steps that Roberta or Sister Robin was on in her journey. But after doing a lot of research on her case and hearing fellow nuns she was with, it seems as though she had made her initial temporary vows and was nearing making her final vows. In June of 1977, Sister Robin was 26 years old and was taking part in a retreat with about a half dozen other women to pray and meditate about this next step. In the year leading up to this, she had been assigned to the Catholic Diocese of Wheeling, Charleston's downtown Wheeling office. Her role in that had been the coordinator of adult religious education, and that had her traveling all over small towns in West Virginia where she met tons of people in her work. I'm not sure how many listeners have ever walked on the grounds of a monastery or a convent, but I have been to a bunch of them, and I have to just say the locations and the connection to the peacefulness of nature just make them often breathtaking. I don't care what religious affiliation you have or if you have none at all, it's hard to just not separate out the beauty and admire these places. They have hiking trails and scenic overlooks, and you can sometimes not pass another human for quite some time. And they're just so quiet. There is something very serene about them to me, and from looking at the videos and pictures of Mount St. Joseph, this looks no different. Acres upon acres of lush rolling hills, trails, and quiet sanctuaries. Nestled amongst it is a chapel and benches and paths. On the morning of June 13th, 1977, Sister Robin stopped by the kitchen to grab an apple and head up to a park bench to do some prayers and meditation. This was around 10:30 a.m. Because she was on a retreat, she was staying at the retreat house versus the mother house. The retreat house was about 100 yards from the hilltop she was going to. I'll share some pictures on our Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. The area is hilly with some shrubbery and bushes, not too far behind where the bench would be. The property is adjacent to a golf course and a park. She was just a tree line away from the neighboring golf course, and at different parts of the hill you can overlook some of the golf holes. One misconception some people have is that these religious communities have no access points, but that's not true. There's no fences or barriers or special things that you need to get through to the grounds because they're typically open to the public. This bench would have been a place that you could have sat and felt the wind blowing through your hair and heard the birds chirping. But that serenity would be disrupted in the worst of ways. At around 1:30 p.m., a groundskeeper stumbled upon the lifeless body of Sister Robin. I want to give a bit of a content warning. I typically try not to be too graphic in describing crime scenes if there isn't a purpose for it, but in this case there is. I want to describe exactly the state of Sister Robin's body because it gives important insight into the crime and details that will come out later. The bench Sister Robin had been on was overturned. Her body was found approximately 40 feet away. She was lying on her back, and her pants and underwear had been pulled down, and her shirt had been pulled up, exposing her breasts. Her arms were outstretched and positioned almost like the image of the crucifix, like as if she was kind of on the cross, which is hard to ignore the idea that the two could be connected. Whoever did this attacked a nun on religious grounds, and then her body was found positioned in that way. When her autopsy was conducted, what had already been suspected was confirmed. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been in the middle of her menstrual cycle, and she still had a tampon in. As far as the cause of her death, she had been manually strangled. A lot of news reports on this case say that she was kneeling down praying when she was attacked, but the overturned bench would indicate that someone came up behind her and a struggle ensued. News reports will also draw the conclusion that she was then dragged or moved 40 feet away where her body was found. Her autopsy revealed that she had bruising on her inner thighs, throat, and neck, but no defensive wounds. She did not have any scrapes from brush or items that might occur if she had been dragged that distance, and the grass didn't show any drag marks either. So one thought, especially with the lack of defensive wounds and careful placement of her body just on the other side of the crest of the hill and more out of view from people looking up, was that the person staked out this location, then came up behind her, immediately incapacitated her, and carried her to this final area where the assault and murder took place. This is certainly a possibility. Another one that is not mentioned but I think is feasible is that the person came up behind her, attacked her, the bench then tipped over, and she attempted to run. He caught up to her, and then the assault took place right where she fell. The lack of defensive wounds don't rule out this scenario to me because this offender had to be very strong. Now, Sister Robin was said to be scrappy and athletic, but at the end of the day, she was still a petite woman, and it's going to be really hard to put up a fight against a very strong man. And they know this man was strong because he manually strangled her, at least that's what they think, because they didn't find any objects nearby, which that's very hard to do, and it was so much so that he had crushed her larynx. Also, in further processing the scene, they found pushed down grass and shrubs that indicated to them that a person may have been sitting there sometime lying in wait. Investigators working this scene worked quickly. The idea that a religious woman could be attacked in what was considered a sacred and safe space in broad daylight was disturbing to the local community and the tri-state area. Police sent bloodhounds out to try to trail the suspect to no avail. People were interviewed all over, including golfers at the nearby course who were there all day, but no one acted suspiciously in their interviews and nobody said they heard anything. Early on in the investigation, a couple of different independent witnesses did say they saw a suspicious man in his vehicle nearby where Sister Robin's attack took place. Police state that the person was driving a late 1960s two-door blue Chevy Impala with religious bumper stickers. The man was between 30 to 40 years old with dark bushy hair and eyebrows, white skin but a dark complexion, 5'10" to 6 feet tall. There is nothing about why they found him suspicious. My sense is maybe just his proximity to the crime scene and no reason why they could place him there otherwise. Investigators looked into Sister Robin's personal life, and she didn't have any big skeletons in her closet. One of the items found in her possession was her journal, in which she shared some trepidation. In one entry, she was reportedly quoted as saying, "My problems seem so small, particularly after talking about Jesus as the suffering Messiah," end quote. But they were really just a lot of religious reflections tied to her life, and she was at a point where she was having to make a big decision, but there was nothing about any men in her life or any problems she was encountering or anyone who was stalking her or harassing her, nothing like that. The only thing that pointed to a possible tie of concern about something going on in her life came from one of her fellow sisters and friends at the convent. She said that just the day before she had talked to Sister Robin, and Robin had said, "I really want to talk to you about something." And then she sort of pulled back and said, "You'll think I'm crazy." And her friend said, "No, go ahead, tell me." But she never did. And so her friend has been haunted all of these years and wondered if whatever she had to tell her was connected. But to the local people of the tri-state area, they had another question. Is this another victim of that serial killer? Around 1976 to 1977 in western Pennsylvania, a violent crime wave was striking fear in the local community. The counties of Allegheny and Washington, which, for reference, were only about a half-hour drive from Sister Robin's murder, depending on what part you're in, they were being plagued by abductions, rapes, and murders. While I can't possibly touch on all of the crime that was occurring, here is some of it. First, Sister Robin's murder was the fifth in a series of young women who were murdered from November of 76 to June of 77 in the area. And these 5 murders were kind of thought to be possibly connected at that time. On November 25th, 1976, a 21-year-old named Susan Rush was abducted after her shift from a local mall in Washington County, Pennsylvania. Her abandoned car was found shortly thereafter, and she was found dead in the trunk. She had been raped and strangled. On February 13th of 1977, 16-year-old Mary Gency was a sophomore in high school, newly pregnant, and the baby's father was her ex-boyfriend, Robert Irwin Jr. She ran a quick errand to a store one morning and never returned. Her body was found 6 days later by hunters. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Mary had gone missing from North Charleroi, Pennsylvania. On March 17, 1977, 17-year-old Debbie Capiola was walking the 5-minute walk down Point Park Road in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, to catch her school bus. Her brother walked with her almost every day, but this day he did not. She never made it. 10 days later, her nude body was found on a hillside near an old strip mine. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with the pant leg of her blue jeans. Brenda Ritter was 18 years old in May of 1977. She was working as a secretary for a local construction company and was living in North Strabane, Pennsylvania. At this point, locals had become fearful of a single person committing all of these crimes, and her friends and family said she was worried too and took her safety very seriously. On May 19th, Brenda decided to leave her boyfriend's house when it began to rain heavily. She never made it home. Her car was found parked on the side of the road. Her purse was on the passenger seat and open, but nothing else in her car was amiss. Her car was pulled over on a stretch of road she wouldn't have taken to go home. There was a nearby airport who pitched in to help look for her by helicopter, and her body was found on a densely wooded hillside with her clothes 50 yards away. She had been raped and then strangled with a tourniquet made from her own underwear and a stick from a nearby bush. Less than a month later would be Sister Robin's death. That's not all that was occurring. There was a spree of double murders and attacks involving forced entry where couples were being attacked in their own homes. The men were shot and murdered, and then the woman would be sexually assaulted and murdered. I'm not going to go too far into these. A suspect was arrested and tied to most of these. And years later, this man, Edward Surratt, who was a long-haul trucker and local to the area, has not been forensically tied to the other cases. But because these were all happening in the same area, I wanted to paint a picture of the fear these people were experiencing. They were terrified. Gun sales were going up even more, and people were just starting to feel very unsafe in their community. There were also some other cases that haven't always been really connected to the conversation, but still have similarities and proximities, and I think they're worth talking about. I have to thank Redditor Love2Clarkson for their summaries and tying these cases together. I will link that Reddit thread in the show notes so you can read their thorough write-up as well. If you back it up to 1973, an 8-year-old named Debbie Mackle rode her school bus 2 miles home from Dry Tavern Elementary School. There, she got off at the bus stop at Rice's Landing, and then she would have had about a 5-minute walk to her home at the end of Hoy Street. That street's a dead-end road. It's a suburban area, but it does have a lot of fairly wooded spaces to it. It was a nice warm day, and a neighbor and a jogger both saw the blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl, and everything seemed fine. Her brothers normally rode the bus with her and then would have done that 5-minute walk home, but they opted to walk home that day so they could sell fundraising magazines. It was about a 2-mile walk from the school. When they arrived home, they found her school bag, keys, and coat on the inside table, so it was clear she had made it home, but she wasn't there. They assumed she was out playing somewhere, and their parents were at work. But after they got home and dinner time came and she still wasn't home, the parents called the police. A large-scale search was immediately conducted, and a few days later, her body was found deep in the woods. She was partially clothed with a pillowcase over her head. Her body had been placed under a log and some leaves. She had been strangled by a piece of twine so viciously it had broken her larynx, and like Sister Robin, she had no defensive wounds. DNA was recovered and preserved. Barbara Lewis was a 30-year-old who was raped and strangled in November of 1976 in Pittsburgh. She was supposed to catch the bus to work alongside her sister at 6:15 a.m., but she was running late, so she caught the 6:30 bus. Or at least she was supposed to. Nobody knows what happened, but at 9:03 a.m., a cleaning lady found her body in a commercial trash bin behind a building a mile from Barbara's home. Her body was still warm. She had been strangled with one nylon stocking, and her hands were tied behind her back with another stocking and a belt from her dress. After she had died, paper gauze had been tightly packed into her nose and mouth. Her underwear was on but inside out, and her bra was torn and partially off. Other personal belongings like her purse were found dumped in a cemetery a week later. What's weird is that the coroner's office stated she had not been raped, but other reporting indicates that she was. There was no mention of DNA collection in her case, and like some of the other cases, she had no defensive wounds. Finally, there is little Beth Lynn Barr. She was only 6 and lived in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. On the afternoon of November 23, 1977, she was given an early dismissal from school due to the Thanksgiving holiday. She had about a 10-minute walk home, and she was going to do this with a friend, but the friend had an appointment on that day, and so she had been picked up by her mother. So she walked home by herself. This was a popular residential area, there was lots of people out, and it was considered normal for kids to walk by themselves. People did see Beth along her route, and the only problem they encountered was an elderly neighbor said he saw Beth talking to a man in a car. It was a blue sedan with red and white license plates, and it was about 3 blocks from her house. Beth did not make it home, and they jumped into action quick. Her father was a police officer himself, so he knew the clock was ticking. He had a full search put together, and everyone was looking for her, but nothing was found. 16 months later, her remains were found in a cemetery in Monroeville, just a few miles away. She had been stabbed in the chest multiple times and was still wearing the clothes she went missing in. Many of these cases sat for decades, not because police didn't want to solve them. They just couldn't push them forward despite hours upon hours upon hours of manpower and investigation. And Sister Robin's was no different. The fact of the matter is, police collected evidence at the time, but back then there just wasn't much they could do with it. The 1970s were known for so many serial killers, in part because we had finally started just using that term. I don't think serial killers just suddenly appeared, but the idea between mapping cases together and creating a psychological profile of these repeat offenders and studying their behavior by the FBI, that was all a new concept. But also it's because they could get away with it easier. Most of these cases didn't have that much in the way of witnesses, so unless someone interrupted a crime in progress or a killer got really sloppy, they went along without being caught. One outlier seemed to be Mary Gency. Her ex-boyfriend and father of her unborn baby was charged with her murder, and later a second schoolboy would be charged in connection with it as well. Then, in the year 2000, 23 years after Sister Robin's murder, police began to try DNA testing now that it had come so far. DNA was of course not new, but in the early 2000s, it started to become less risky to test DNA, and you didn't need as much DNA evidence to test. Prior to that, you would need larger amounts, or there would be the fear that you wasted all of the DNA on just that one thing, so if it didn't pan out, you were in trouble and you wouldn't have that evidence anymore. And with it, they got a big break. DNA testing linked 50-year-old David Kennedy to the murder of Debbie Capiola from St. Patrick's Day in 1977. She had been strangled with her own blue jeans, and the killer had left behind semen on those jeans. That testing was tied to Kennedy, who had actually been a suspect early on due to matching a vehicle description, and because it turned out he had been stalking Debbie for some time. They just couldn't prove it at the time, and so now DNA had caught up with him. This success pushed investigators to test more cases in the area that were unsolved, or rather, it likely justified the funding to do so, because now they could say, look, we had success here, let's see if we can connect others. These other cases were not linked to Kennedy, but they did reveal something that nobody saw coming. While they didn't reveal a suspect, they did reveal a victim connection. The DNA from Sister Robin Elam's case matched that to those of the others, that of 21-year-old Susan Rush. So let's dig a bit further into Susan's case. Susan was 21 and worked at the Washington Mall. She was very sheltered and deeply religious. She spent time with her family and had never yet been out on a date. On November 25th, 1976, she left her department store job at 5 p.m. and went to Weight Watchers, which was in the same plaza but across the parking lot. She was due to meet up with her family at Thanksgiving church services at 7 p.m. that evening, but she didn't show, which was highly uncharacteristic of her. Her family traced her steps but couldn't locate her car in or around the mall parking lot. They searched along nearby roads thinking her car just broke down. They found nothing until the next day when her brother Gary found her car parked along the road of North Avenue, less than a mile from the mall. It was across the highway from the mall in a small residential neighborhood. Gary was alarmed. Her car was locked, but her bra and underwear were sitting on the front seat. Terrified, he moved to the trunk, and with one pop of the trunk, his heart was shattered. In it was the body of his sister. Her torn pants had been redressed on her, and her turtleneck was put back on her, but inside out. She had been strangled with a piece of leather so severely, her larynx was crushed. She had no other bruises or scratches on her body except for the ligature marks, and she had no defensive wounds. She had been sexually assaulted, and that DNA tied her to the case of Sister Robin. In comparing the cases, they were about 7 months apart. Both were attacked in daylight from a place that was high risk to the offender getting caught. Both were strangled and had no defensive wounds. It just makes me wonder the why behind that. How was he able to accomplish this crime without the victims fighting back? Both had odd but different staging of the body. In the case of Susan, she was presumably abducted and then moved to a second location, whereas Sister Robin's murder had one primary crime scene. The women were both deeply religious, though it's unclear how the suspect would know this about Susan and if this is connected. But something in my gut just tells me it is. Even though the DNA matches, they still have not had success in matching that DNA to a suspect. With a new cold case investigation team digging into Sister Robin's case in the 2000s, a once eliminated suspect resurfaced, a man named John Shoplack. He had been investigated early on after a friend went to police because of some comments Shoplack made to him about killing a nun. He had told his friend that he had hidden behind in the bushes, come out, attacked her from behind with a belt, and he said that she was either a virgin or on her period because he had blood on him after the assault. This was a detail that police had not released to the public at that time. Even though that is incredibly incriminating, they eliminated him in the 70s because his blood type did not match that of the killers. As it turns out, the blood type was pulled from his military records, which at that time had a pretty high error rate. Police worked to re-interview people close to him. A former girlfriend attested that John did not like Catholic people and that he had once choked her. He also had been accused of raping 2 girls and had also robbed his own grandmother, chopping off her finger to get her ring. A TV documentary in 2019 that I linked in the show notes said that John Shoplack had died earlier that year, so they couldn't question him or easily get his DNA. However, at the time, they were working to see if the hospital had any tissue samples still from a recent hospitalization prior to his death. As of 2019, there was not enough of a sample to work with to do forensic genealogy based on what was said during that same TV documentary. But I wonder, is there enough from Susan's case to do it? Despite there being DNA evidence, there has not been any updates to the case since 2019. I wonder if a Shoplack family member could be swabbed to compare DNA in that way if the plan with the hospital didn't work out. Obviously, I do not have the insight into the case that the professionals do, and from what I can tell, those working the case seem extremely haunted by the unsolved brutal homicide. I just can't help but think that after all these years, her case is so very close to having answers, and that solving one case means solving another too, and possibly even these others. All of the other cases I mentioned still also remain unsolved to this day as well, and there isn't a lot out there about what has been compared to further see if any more of the cases are connected. Most locals, including law enforcement, believe that there was 2, if not 3, active serial killers operating in the tri-state area in the mid to late 70s. And short of giving them a name, their eerie presence still haunts the area and all of those who have to live there and who have lost loved ones. If you have any information on the murder of Sister Robin Elam, please contact the West Virginia State Police at 304-746-2100, or you can contact your local state police who will channel you appropriately. This has been A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the podcast and the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review and follow me wherever you listen. You can also follow and interact with our Instagram page where I post pictures of all the cases that I cover, at Simpler Time Crime Pod, or you can follow us on Facebook or TikTok. Join me next Monday for another unsolved case, and as always, thank you so much for listening.